Yo-ho, ladies and gents, the Ginger Geek here once again with your weekly look at the obscure games that slip under the radar. Today we'll be having a gander at Eric Chahi's underrated classic, Heart of Darkness. Now, Heart of Darkness was one of my all-time favourite video games growing up as a child. It's a cinematic platformer, a genre that I believe is highly underused, and it has an excellent setting. The game follows the protagonist Andy, a little boy with a phobia of the dark who travels to a different world in search of his kidnapped dog Whiskey. The only problem is the world he travels to is the Darklands, where absolutely everything in sight likes to murder children with methodical brutality. What follows that initial setup is a extremely varied, just adventure. It's a superbly cinematic experience that in many ways is way ahead of its time. Like, for example, you see how this sequence starts off gameplay but then kind of seamlessly blends in small little CG elements to make a cutscene integrate well into the experience? This is the kind of stuff that the Uncharted series is only experimenting with now. The game's incredibly atmospheric, selling its setting with beautiful pre-rendered backgrounds that hold up to this day, and an abundance of animation, making everyone from the protagonist to all of the enemy creatures feel tangible and full of life. Obviously, there are some other ways in which it's limited by the technology of the time. You just have to look at the absolutely garish standard of the main CG cutscenes to see evidence of this. But it doesn't let that hold it back much. You can tell there's been a real love poured into this game. The world feels huge in scale as you travel through jungles, cliffs, volcanic mountains and underwater. Everything falls into this wonderfully immersive, twisted environment. One word of warning though, this game is hard. Hard to the point where it can put some people off. On your first playthrough of this game, you will die. A lot. I remember as a child being able to breeze through most of the platforming sequences and only getting stumped on the puzzles, but as an adult revisiting the game, I was taken aback by how much this had flipped. While the puzzles, while mechanically sound, seemed much simpler, everything else kicked 7 shades out of me. Every screen I cleared felt like a monumental achievement. I never at any point felt the difficulty was too much personally, but I could understand how seeing these horrendously violent death sequences on repeat would grate after a while. Can you believe this game is rated E for everyone? Something else worth being wary of is that the controls are decidedly Marmite. They imitate the same kind of movement of other cinematic platformers, and while the intention is to make it a more realistic experience, some people often complain movement in this way feels sticky or sluggish. Just something worth considering if you think this game is worth trying from the footage you're seeing. Again, while this is something that didn't bother me personally, I feel it is worth mentioning. My only real gripe with the game is its length. Even with the intense difficulty, it only lasts just over a few hours. Now, it might be that this is due to the amount that the game pushes the PS1 to its limits. I mean, it does even separate onto 2 discs after all, despite its short length. But it still feels over all too quickly. I suppose, however, the greatest compliment you can give a game is that you don't want it to end. Other than this criticism, I think this is a brilliant game that deserved to do way better than it did. It echoes the excellence of the likes of Flashback and Another World. Simply put, this should not be considered a cult classic. It should simply be considered a classic. On that note, you can probably guess that I absolutely 100% recommend this title. I loved it as a kid and I love it just as much as an adult. It's aged amazingly well, and I think every one of you should go experience this absolutely wonderful title. Anyway, I think that's enough gushing for one day. Thus concludes yet another episode of the Obscure Review. I've been your Obscure Reviewer, the Ginger Geek. If you liked this video and would like to see more underrated or hidden away titles get a spot in the limelight, then please like and subscribe to help us create more content. Or feel free to comment with any recommendations of things you think we should take a look at. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.